Recently, two films released both dealing with the multiverse as their main core, these being Everything Everywhere All at Once and Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. There's been a lot of talk about how one is superior to the other in the ways it uses the multiverse. Activia legend herself, Jamie Lee Curtis, even going on an Instagram spree to bring up this comparison. But I don't necessarily think comparing these in terms of quality is very interesting. Rather, I want to look at some of the similarities and key differences these projects offer with the use of the multiverse. Before getting into these things, warning, there are inherent spoilers for talking about these two projects. Oh, also a lot of the MCU, Flashpoint Paradox, and Rick and Morty, which is a sentence that somehow removed the deodorant from my body. Anyway, these projects are kind of hard to skirt around in a comparison piece. The similarities are pretty easy with these two main pieces. These both deal with the multiverse, but divert in how they approach getting to those different timelines. Everything Everywhere has characters do crazy things in order to gain knowledge of alternative versions of themselves, with the possibility of tapping into memories of the other versions of said person. Multiverse of Madness, however, is multiverse jumping through the character of America Chavez. Bouncing into these different universes, we get glimpses of differing Stephen Stranges. Now, what's interesting is both of these protagonists are middle-aged and somewhat unsatisfied with where they are in life. Seeing different versions of themselves, they both have a love interest, they also see different iterations of going through this conflict with them, female villains, and both oddly have brief imagery of opening a third eye. Now, before getting into the key differences and what these films are saying about the multiverse, I want to talk about how these films use the multiverse as a device and structure. As much as people want to use the criticism of certain multiverse films feeling like plot devices, I think it's important to note that all films need a device in which drives the plot. Obviously, good films don't make you notice the strings that are puppeteering your entertainment, but they still exist nonetheless. With both Multiverse of Madness and Everything Everywhere, the inciting incident in the plot is driven by the introduction of the multiverse. America Chavez comes into the world of our Earth's Stephen Strange, and Strange has to protect her from the evils that want to get her powers. And with Evelyn, the main plot doesn't get revealed until her other universe husband introduces the idea of the multiverse and the threat of Jobu Tupaki. As opposed to a film like Flashpoint Paradox, where the inciting incident is him going back in time to save his mother, thus creating a newer timeline and needing to get back to his original own world. In Everything Everywhere, the characters are given this MacGuffin that lets them jump into different realities to gain abilities, whereas in Doctor Strange, we're given a character as a MacGuffin. And when I say MacGuffin, there's no negative implication, it's just again something that drives the movie. But it does seem a little bit of a missed opportunity to not give America Chavez more to do besides one pivotal scene. She's mostly treated as something that needs to be protected or obtained by the characters of this film. The difference is Evelyn is a constant in our universe and stays in the same universe for the majority of the film, while Doctor Strange is largely gone from his universe for the duration of his movie. This was interesting to me because for Evelyn, essentially everything is culminating in her universe, whereas Doctor Strange is the center point traveling through the universe with no one else universe hopping. This compared to something like the height of multiverse cinema, the Timmy Power Hour, where the two universes with dual protagonists intermingle with one another, is an interesting contrast that I honestly might have liked seeing from either of these movies, just for a bit if anything. But the messaging differences are where it gets interesting with these two and what each of these films are trying to say. Let's start with the Multiverse of Madness. Right off the bat, Multiverse of Madness is ingrained in the MCU world that has already partially brought up alternative realities. Looking at Loki and No Way Home specifically, both of which meet the themes that are present in the Multiverse of Madness. In all of these works, we're given the idea that although there are different variations of oneself, they all fall under some same deterministic view of that character. In Multiverse of Madness, we're met with this group called the Illuminati, who have done extensive research on multiple different timelines and have found that the biggest threat to the multiverse is Doctor Strange, showing that in every timeline, the most erratic person is him. This was fascinating to me because at first I thought this was just Multiverse of Madness's view of the multiverse. But once I started thinking back on the universe, so far that has been maintained in all of the MCU. In the series Loki, Owen Wilson mentions to the titular character that throughout the entire multiverses of possibilities, the most deviant of all beings is always going to be a Loki. In No Way Home, all three Spider-Men recant the toils of being a hero the city desperately needs, and for each of them, it is a burden they bear of being Spider-Man. Granted, with Spider-Man, there are 3 data points to go on that are all roughly based on different versions of the same character of Peter Parker, and it may have been created off the critical success of an animated movie, but that's a point for another time. Loki and Doctor Strange both definitively say that these 2 characters have a predetermined life no matter what, compared to something like Flashpoint Paradox, where all the characters are very different from their alternative selves. Loki and Strange exist to disrupt the many universes, which I thought it was an interesting coincidence that these 2 fairly recent projects have 2 of the exact same themes. But I realized these 2 started from the same mind, screenwriter and producer Michael Waldron. He has produced and or written for both of these series the upcoming Kevin Feige Star Wars project, Community, and even the Game Grumps YouTube series Good Game, that I only know about because of a great Afterthoughts video that you should check out on a very poorly written scene. But the biggest thing to point out here is he started as an intern for Adult Swim working on a little show that you might have heard of, Rick and Morty.
I'm a pickle! I'm Pickle Rick!
Now this would seem pretty innocuous off first glance. Rick and Morty is a very popular show, and of course, a ton of the talent is going to go and work on other stuff. But it is kind of hard to overlook the fact Rick and Morty also has a deterministic view of characters in its show. In multiple episodes of the series, they go to Ricklantis, where a bunch of Rick Sanchez's from other universes come and hang out. In all of these universes, Rick is a nihilistic, mean person who always has his grandson doing whatever menial work they need for him. This is the same determinism we see from our 2 characters, Loki and Strange, which granted probably still has a lot of story to be told, but both currently are deterministic characters. The interesting part is the message in the final act of Doctor Strange, because personally, I'm not sure if it's trying to say anything about Strange's determinism. There are 2 key scenes in the final act. The first, when Strange sees another version of himself in what we'll call the Dark Universe. Evil Strange asks him, "How do you know you're not an imposter?" To which our Strange replies about the story of how he lost his sister when he was a boy. Then Evil Strange nods his head, confirming a similar thing likely happened to him. Now, I will preface, this could be chalked up to just being an evil villain and lying to catch Strange while he isn't ready. But I think it's much more interesting to examine what it would mean if this wasn't the case. In this scenario, this small nugget offers us the suggestion that every Stephen Strange deals with tragedy in order to become who they are. This would seem to double down with the Illuminati's assertion that there is some degree of determinism with the character of Doctor Strange. The last and most important point happens in the final battle, when it would seem that Strange ignores what is best for the universe by keeping America Chavez alive. This is an interesting parallel because in No Way Home, Strange kind of trivializes Peter Parker's small wants at the end, specifically because it's for the greater good. And granted, a human life is very different stakes, but it still seems like a neat comparison between these 2 films. This determinism is also coupled with the scene with an alternative Rachel McAdams, who also all view him as needing to hold the knife, something our Rachel McAdams says in Strange's original universe, almost emphasizing this determinism. There are only 2 versions of this character, but of the 2, they kind of treat this relationship as something that can never work out. Again, back to the determinism. But theoretically, in letting go of control and letting America Chavez take the reins, he is going against this deterministic view that Rachel McAdams has of him, correct? But the problem is, there is a view that in keeping the multiverse jumping powers in the hands of a literal child, it could definitely cause some conflict in the multiverse, thus proving the original Illuminati point correct, which I kind of think muddles the message of all the Stephen Stranges in the multiverse. But enough about Stephen Strange. Let's talk about Wanda. There's an interesting bit of lore dropped at the start of the movie that we see our other lives in our dreams, which many have pointed out that would have some interesting implications into previous nightmares from Tony Stark. But looking at this from Scarlet, which, if we trust her word, every night she goes to bed, she dreams of being with her kids, only to wake up to a nightmare of her reality, where she doesn't have her children. I don't want to nitpick here, so viewing this at face value would seem to confirm that in every universe, Scarlet Witch is a loving mother of 2 boys that I guess all sing about ice cream like 2 Victorian children.
Ice cream.
It was pitchy and spots. I don't know. I didn't feel it.
I bring this up because this would seem to align with the deterministic view of this movie, except our Wanda doesn't have kids. And in doing so, this film created a reverse protagonist that we would typically see in a character like Evelyn. A chosen one that breaks the typical confines for what this character should be in all the universes, except she's the villain of this story, instead disrupting the natural order of the universe. Switching gears, we move to Everything Everywhere All at Once. There's a lot of stuff to discuss, but again, let's focus on the message of the multiverse. Because we were talking about determinism, there are 2 characters that might fit this description. One brief hint that with Waymond wanting to be with his wife in multiple universes, which the film isn't really saying, it's more to send a message in the finale. But the bigger one is Joy, who has a nihilistic view of the universe that she has been able to jump into, leading to her seeing the infinite multiverse as a whole lot of nothing. And if you want to hear some fun nihilism, maybe I'll finally release the full Everything Everywhere All at Once video on my Patreon next month. Yeah, you got any nihilism, kids? But I don't know if I'd count this as determinism, as it's a view of each of the universes, not individual characters. I only bring this up because Everything Everywhere seems like the polar opposite of the messaging of Multiverse of Madness, instead opting for an indeterministic view of these characters in this film. We're given this character of Evelyn, and as mentioned, she's not the most happy with where she is at in life, almost falling for this view her other universe daughter Joy has of nihilism in the multiverse. But instead, by the end, she rejects this ideal entirely. In each of these universes we see with Evelyn that all have their own positives and negatives seem to all differ in how they play out. There's one where she's a cook, a movie star, even a rock. Personally, I don't think this film is saying one of these is superior to the others. Instead of there being a through line of each Evelyn, all of them seem very different in their timelines. The only determined thing is there will be perseverance in order to reach a greater point of happiness. This is seen in this montage mostly focused on Evelyn with hot dog hands falling in love with her tax collector, where she mentions we figured out how to excel with our feet in the face of hot dog hands. Evelyn is this really unique protagonist that we would typically see the chosen one trope played by a teenage white boy. But on top of this difference, instead of the typical power from within, it's only through her optimism that she learns through her other life that she's able to overcome the fear of the hopelessness. This is especially interesting because of the changing circumstances that one of the directors had while making this film, which if you want to hear more about that, I'll discuss in the video I mentioned before. Okay, thanks, bye. I don't think either of these are a wrong approach to the multiverse, but it's intriguing that 2 very opposing forces, small budget versus big budget films, have polar opposite views on the multiverse theory. Multiverse of Madness pitches this idea of being predetermined for the role we play in the universe and trying to break those confines that are laid out for characters, which feels like something that, as mentioned, has been building in this phase of the series for some kind of statement. Then you have Everything Everywhere, which says, sure, you could be a movie star in another life, but you could also be a literal rock, and yet there's still tons of fulfillment in all of those different iterations of ourselves. To say this is because of the confines of how the art was made would be pretty misguided. I mean, who knows? There's a universe where a $3 million movie is deterministic and a big studio film is indeterministic. Both of these writers are in their mid-30s, and it's interesting because both of them seem to be having similar discussions that are inherently tied to typical millennial problems. With how the wealth disparity is growing and the rise of comparing yourself to anything you see on the ever-present social media now, it's easy to cling to this idea of determinism in your life when it doesn't feel like you have a lot of choices in your circumstances you were dealt. I'm curious to see how this ends up playing out with the rise of so many people in this age demographic finally getting to share their voice in film, and if this deterministic debate continues in more films to come. But that's a video. Video is done. I did it. Later, haters.